Right, so get ready because today we are going to deep dive into one of the most devastating events
Yeah,
of the 20th century.
absolutely.
The Holodomor.
Really is.
It's a Ukrainian word
Right.
that literally means to kill by starvation. And it refers to the man-made famine that ravaged Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s.
Yeah.
Our source for this deep dive
Right.
is a YouTube documentary
Okay.
from Ukraine today called Documentary Ukraine's Holodomor, Suffering Under Soviet Death by Hunger Policy.
Okay. Interesting.
We're going to uncover the how and the why of this catastrophe.
All right.
Like, how could this happen?
Yeah.
What were the factors that led to this? Were there any acts of resistance?
Right.
And what are the lasting impacts on Ukrainian society and identity?
Yeah.
All those questions.
The documentary sets a chilling scene right from the start.
Okay.
It describes Ukraine before the famine as a land overflowing with milk and honey,
Wow.
a breadbasket of Europe, but then in a brutally swift turn,
Right.
it plunges us into the heart of the famine,
Okay.
where millions faced death by starvation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So the documentary throws out some staggering numbers,
Right.
estimating that 7 to 10 million people perished.
Yeah.
To grasp the sheer scale of this tragedy,
Yeah.
imagine a city the size of New York, wiped off the map.
Right. And the most unsettling part is
Yeah.
this wasn't some natural disaster.
This was a famine,
This was a famine.
engineered by Soviet policies.
Wow.
Yeah.
So to understand how a famine of this magnitude could even be orchestrated,
Right.
we kind of have to go into the mechanics of starvation.
Oh, right. For sure.
Like, how does that even happen?
So the documentary vividly portrays the physiological effects,
Okay.
the body consuming itself.
Yeah.
First fat reserves, then muscle,
Right?
then even the sugar from your liver.
Wow. So your body just starts to break down.
It describes blood hunger.
This insatiable craving that takes over.
So it's not just physical.
Right.
There's a deep psychological dimension to starvation, too.
Yeah.
And it's just as horrifying, I imagine.
For sure. Yeah.
This blood hunger sounds like something straight out of a horror movie.
It really does.
What kind of psychological effects are we talking about?
Well, imagine the mental anguish
Okay.
of constantly being on the verge of starvation,
Yeah.
the gnawing hunger, the obsessive search for even the smallest morsel of food.
Right.
People become fixated on food,
Yeah.
unable to think of anything else.
Okay.
The documentary highlights the profound depression,
Right.
apathy, and loss of willpower that sets in.
So really starts to impact their entire,
Right.
like, way of thinking and being.
Yeah.
And these effects ripple outwards. They impact families,
Right.
communities,
Yeah.
and ultimately an entire nation.
Exactly.
So the documentary brings this human cost to life through the story of the KAC family.
Yeah.
They were successful farmers, clearly proud of their land and their way of life.
Yeah.
And then, almost overnight, everything changes for them
Right.
with the Soviet policy of collectivization.
Yeah, the KAC family's story is
Yeah.
a microcosm of what happened all across Ukraine.
Okay.
Collectivization was this grand Soviet scheme
Yeah.
to eliminate private land ownership
Okay.
and force peasants into these collective farms.
Right.
Farmers, like the KACs, were labeled as kulaks, enemies of the state, because of their relative success.
So they were successful. So they were enemies of the state.
They were labeled that way
Okay.
and stripped of everything they had worked for,
Wow.
their land,
Right.
livestock
Oh,
tools.
confiscated.
So the KAC family goes from being successful independent farmers to
Right. Actually, employees of the state
yeah,
working on land that no longer belongs to them. So they just become cogs in the machine.
exactly. And it wasn't just a change in ownership.
Okay.
Collectivization also marked a shift in ideology,
Okay.
a clash between individual initiative and
Right.
the socialist vision of collective farming.
Okay. Yeah.
You see, the Soviet government had initially implemented the new economic policy,
Right.
or NEP,
Yeah.
which allowed for some private enterprise in agriculture,
Okay.
but they abruptly abandoned that approach.
So they went with the NEP
Yeah.
and then totally changed directions
Yes,
and
they-
went hardcore collectivization.
In favor of this hardline collectivization policy.
It seems like this radical shift from the NEP to collectivization really set the stage for disaster.
Right.
But how did collectivization directly translate into a famine? Was it simply that these collective farms were inefficient?
Okay.
and couldn't produce enough food?
That was certainly a factor,
Oh, yeah.
but it was more complex than just inefficiency.
Yeah.
The Soviet government implemented these incredibly unrealistic grain procurement quotas, demanding huge amounts of grain from Ukraine,
Right.
far more than was realistically being produced,
Yes.
even under ideal circumstances.
Wow.
And to meet these quotas,
Okay.
they resorted to brutal tactics,
Right.
seizing grain from peasants.
So just taking it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Leaving them with barely enough to survive.
This brings us to those harrowing personal stories that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The documentary is filled with accounts from survivors, detailing their desperate attempts to find anything edible.
Yeah.
It paints a bleak picture of people eating potato pancakes made from frozen potatoes,
Wow.
catching gophers,
Really?
and even boiling grass just to stave off starvation.
It's hard to even imagine.
Yeah.
These accounts really underscore the psychological impact of this prolonged manufactured hunger.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking to hear about children
Yeah.
who couldn't fully comprehend what was happening,
Right.
but sensed their parents' despair
Yeah.
and the crushing weight of their unspoken fear.
The documentary doesn't just tell us about the famine.
Right.
It immerses us in the emotional experience of those who lived through it.
Exactly.
And the documentary doesn't let us forget that this wasn't just about hunger.
Right.
It was about the complete unraveling of society.
Yeah.
And it describes a mother who was so desperate to feed her children
Yeah.
that she allowed herself to be yoked to a plow,
Oh, wow.
treated like an animal just to earn a meager ration.
That scene is particularly haunting.
Yeah.
It illustrates the unimaginable lengths to which parents went,
Right.
the sacrifices they were forced to make
Yeah.
to try and save their children.
And even those sacrifices weren't always enough.
Right.
The documentary shares the tragic story of a sister who, after finding some hidden bread, overate and died.
Oh, no.
It raises this incredibly difficult moral question.
Yeah.
In such dire circumstances, could you snatch a piece of bread from someone else's child
Right.
to save your own?
That's the question the documentary asks.
Yeah.
And it forces us to confront the ethical dilemmas of the Holodomor.
Right?
The desperation,
Yeah.
the breakdown of social norms, the sheer will to survive.
Yeah.
It's one thing to read about it in history books,
Right.
but to hear those stories,
Yeah.
to imagine yourself in those shoes,
Right.
it's a heavy burden to carry.
Yeah, this famine wasn't just a natural disaster.
Right.
It was meticulously orchestrated tragedy.
Yes.
The documentary makes it clear that the Soviet government's policies,
Right.
specifically collectivization
Yeah.
and the unrealistic grain procurement quotas, directly led to the suffering and death of millions of Ukrainians.
Absolutely.
But it also reveals the complexities of the situation,
Yeah.
showcasing the psychological effects of starvation
Right.
and the impossible choices people were forced to make.
Yeah, it really does.
But amidst the despair, did any acts of resistance emerge?
Right.
Was there any pushback against this systematic starvation?
That's where things get even more complex.
Okay.
The documentary shows us that while there was resistance,
Yeah.
it was often met with brutal suppression.
Right.
There were hunger riots,
Yeah.
clashes with authorities, and even instances of peasants hiding grain.
So they tried to hold on to whatever they had.
Exactly.
The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, struggled to maintain order, and regular troops had to be deployed to quell the unrest.
They did.
It's clear that people weren't simply accepting their fate.
No.
So there were sparks of defiance.
Yes.
But was there ever any organized rebellion against the Soviet regime?
The documentary highlights a particularly gripping story
Okay.
about a man named Gregory GTO
All right.
and his family's daring escape from Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
It speaks volumes about the risks people were willing to take,
Yeah.
the lengths they would go to for a chance at survival.
Their escape is a testament to the human will to survive.
It is.
But it also begs the question,
Right.
why wasn't there a larger scale uprising
Yeah.
against the Soviet regime?
That's a question historians continue to debate.
Okay.
It's important to remember the context.
Right.
The Soviet regime was incredibly repressive.
Yeah.
People lived in constant fear of the NKVD.
Right.
And the repercussions of any dissent, a full-scale uprising, was incredibly risky.
Yeah.
Especially given the widespread hunger and lack of resources.
Right.
It's a stark reminder that resistance takes many forms.
Yeah.
And sometimes even the smallest acts of defiance can be incredibly courageous.
So even just trying to hold on to some of your grain
Exactly.
could be an act of resistance in these circumstances.
Yeah. We've been focusing on the experiences of those in the countryside,
Right.
the farmers directly targeted by collectivization.
Yeah.
But the documentary doesn't limit its scope to rural Ukraine.
Okay.
It also explores the complex relationship
Right.
between those suffering in the famine-stricken countryside
Yeah.
and those living in the relative abundance of the cities.
So were urban dwellers completely oblivious
Right.
to the suffering unfolding just beyond the city limits?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
The documentary points to a wave of desperate refugees fleeing the countryside,
Yeah.
hoping to find food in the cities.
Makes sense.
The authorities tried to control this influx,
Right.
but the evidence of the famine became impossible to ignore.
But even with this influx of starving refugees,
Right.
there wasn't a groundswell of support or outrage.
Yeah.
How did urban residents reconcile themselves
Mhm.
with the horrific suffering happening around them?
The documentary uses a thought-provoking term
Right.
to describe the attitude of many city dwellers:
Okay.
social infantilism.
Oh, wow.
It argues that fear and obedience,
Yeah.
coupled with a focus on self-preservation, led to a widespread silence,
Okay.
a passive acceptance of the situation.
So basically just kind of keeping your head down
Yeah.
and hoping to survive.
Exactly.
It's hard to fathom that level of apathy
Yeah,
in the face of such widespread suffering.
right.
Was there anything else contributing to this social infantilism?
Mm-hmm.
Could have been more than just fear and self-preservation.
We have to remember the pervasive propaganda machine
Right.
of the Soviet regime.
Yeah, of course.
Many city dwellers might have genuinely believed
Right.
that these sacrifices, however horrific,
Yeah.
were necessary for the greater good of building a socialist utopia.
So sacrificing for the better good,
Exactly.
this propaganda machine,
Right.
combined with the very real fear of repercussions for speaking out, created a stifling atmosphere where dissent was incredibly dangerous.
Absolutely.
This social infantilism you mentioned raises another question.
Okay.
Did the famine itself contribute to this sense of apathy?
It's possible.
Did the constant hunger,
Right.
the struggle for survival, leave people with the emotional or mental capacity
Yeah.
to care about anything beyond their own immediate needs?
That's a crucial point.
Okay.
The documentary gives us a glimpse into the psychological toll
Yeah.
of prolonged starvation.
Right.
And it's not hard to imagine how it could lead to a kind of emotional numbness.
I guess so.
Yeah.
If all you're thinking about is just surviving,
Right.
you don't have the energy
Yeah.
to really care about others.
Exactly.
When you're constantly preoccupied with finding your next meal, when every ounce of your energy is directed towards basic survival,
Right.
it becomes difficult, perhaps even impossible,
Yeah.
to muster the empathy and energy needed to challenge a powerful regime.
It does.
So we see that the famine wasn't just a physical catastrophe. It also eroded the very fabric of society,
Right.
fostering fear,
Yeah.
obedience, and ultimately a chilling indifference to the suffering of others.
Right.
But the documentary isn't just about the immediate impact of the famine. It also explores the long-term legacy of the Holodomor
Right.
on Ukrainian identity and its collective memory.
The documentary underscores this lingering fear of hunger
Okay.
that has been passed down through generations, a deep-seated anxiety that persists even in times of plenty.
Wow.
It's as though the trauma of the Holodomor is etched into the DNA of the Ukrainian people.
The documentary shares a powerful story
Right.
about an author who encountered people denying or downplaying the severity of the Holodomor.
Oh, wow.
It's a stark reminder that the struggle for recognition,
Yeah.
for historical truth, is ongoing.
That struggle against historical revisionism is incredibly important.
Yeah.
The Holodomor was systematically erased
Right.
from official Soviet history for decades.
Yeah, like it never even happened.
Right.
And the denial continues in some circles even today.
It does.
It underscores the importance of preserving the memory of these events,
Right.
of ensuring that the voices of the victims are heard.
Absolutely.
This fight for recognition speaks to a deeper issue,
Okay.
the need for truth and reconciliation. How can a nation heal? How can it move forward
Right.
if its history is distorted or denied?
The documentary doesn't shy away from uncomfortable truths.
Right.
It forces us to confront the question of complicity, not just on the part of the Soviet regime, but also on the part of those who carried out the grain seizures, those who remained silent, and even those who benefited from the famine.
This idea of complicity is a difficult one to grapple with.
It is.
On one hand, you have the Soviet leadership driven by their ideology and their ruthless pursuit of power. But then you have those individuals who, perhaps out of desperation or fear, became instruments of this horrific policy.
It's a nuanced and complex issue.
Yeah.
The documentary highlights that many of those involved in carrying out the grain confiscations were themselves peasants. Often driven by a need to survive or by the fear of being labeled as enemies of the state. It forces us to consider the ways in which systems of oppression can corrupt even those who are themselves victims.
So we see this interplay between ideology, power, and individual agency. But what about those who weren't directly involved in the grain seizures? Those who witnessed the suffering but didn't speak out. Can we hold them accountable for their silence?
It's easy to judge from our vantage point.
Yeah, of course.
But as we've discussed, the context of fear and repression under the Soviet regime cannot be ignored.
You can't really know unless you're there.
People lived under the constant threat of the NKVD. Speaking out, even whispering a word of dissent could have dire consequences, not just for themselves, but for their families.
It seems there are many layers to this issue of complicity.
There are.
There's the complicity of those who actively participated in the grain seizures, but also the complicity of those who knew what was happening but chose to look away, to remain silent.
Exactly.
And the documentary doesn't let us off the hook either.
It doesn't.
It challenges us, the viewers, to consider our own potential for complicity. Would we have had the courage to speak out against such injustice?
It's a tough question.
Would we have risked our own safety and that of our loved ones to help those in need?
It really makes you think.
These are uncomfortable questions, but ones worth asking.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It shapes who we are today, and it informs the choices we make, both individually and as a society.
It really does.
As we've been discussing the Holodomor, it's clear that this wasn't just some abstract historical event. It was a deeply personal tragedy for millions of Ukrainians.
Absolutely.
And the documentary does an incredible job of conveying that human cost through the stories of survivors.
The power of those personal stories is undeniable. They allow us to connect with the Holodomor on a visceral level, to understand the desperation, the resilience, and the sheer brutality of what these people endured.
There's one story that has really stayed with me. It's the account of a woman who described how, as a young girl during the famine, she would wander through the fields, desperately searching for anything edible. She recalled eating weeds, tree bark, anything to quell the gnawing hunger.
That image of a child scavenging for scraps of food in a barren landscape, it's a powerful indictment of the cruelty of this man-made famine.
Absolutely.
And it speaks to the resilience of those who survive, the sheer will to live that allowed them to endure such unimaginable hardship.
And it wasn't just about finding food.
No.
The documentary highlights the lengths people went to just to stay alive. We hear stories of families bartering their most prized possessions for a handful of grain. Of people risking their lives to escape across the border.
To get away.
And of mothers giving their last morsel of food to their children.
Those acts of sacrifice, of love in the face of unimaginable suffering, they really underscore the depth of the human spirit.
It's hard to imagine.
It is.
But the documentary doesn't shy away from the darker side of this story either. It reveals how the famine led to a breakdown of social norms, how desperation could push people to the brink of their moral limits.
Absolutely.
There's a particularly disturbing account of a man who confessed to resorting to cannibalism.
Oh, wow.
Driven to this horrific act out of sheer desperation to survive. It's a chilling reminder of the dehumanizing effects of starvation.
It really is.
How it can erode our most fundamental values and push us to the edge of our humanity.
It's a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked power. Of how an ideology taken to extremes can lead to such barbarity.
But even in those darkest moments, the documentary reveals glimmers of hope. Stories of individuals who clung to their humanity,
Right.
who showed compassion, even in the face of unimaginable suffering.
Yeah.
One story that stands out is the account of a woman who risked her own life
Wow.
to hide grain from the authorities,
Okay.
sharing it with her starving neighbors.
It's a testament to the enduring power of empathy,
Right.
the capacity for kindness even in the most dire circumstances.
These acts of courage and compassion, however small,
Yeah.
provide a powerful counterpoint to the prevailing narrative of despair.
Right.
They remind us that even in the face of unimaginable evil,
Yeah.
the human spirit can endure.
It can.
That hope can flicker even amidst the darkness.
Absolutely.
The documentary ends with a question
Okay.
that continues to resonate long after the credits roll.
Right.
So who can be the judge?
Yeah.
It's a question that challenges us to grapple with the complexities of the Holodomor, to confront the uncomfortable truths about human nature, and to consider our own responsibility to learn from the past.
It's a question that invites us to think critically.
Yeah.
To move beyond simplistic narratives of good versus evil.
Right.
And to acknowledge the nuances of human behavior in times of crisis.
Yeah.
It's a question that forces us to confront our own biases,
Right.
our own potential for complicity,
Mm-hmm.
and to ask ourselves,
Yeah.
what would we have done in such circumstances?
It's a question that has no easy answers,
No, it doesn't.
but it's a question that we must continue to ask,
Right.
to wrestle with,
Yeah.
if we are to truly understand the Holodomor
Absolutely.
and its enduring legacy.
It is important.
Because ultimately,
Right.
this isn't just about remembering the past.
Right.
It's about using that knowledge to shape a better future.
And that begins with acknowledging the truth.
Yeah.
With honoring the memory of those who perished.
Right.
And with committing ourselves to the pursuit of justice and accountability.
Absolutely.
It means challenging historical revisionism, confronting denial and minimization, and ensuring that the voices of the victims are heard.
It means understanding the root causes of the Holodomor.
Yeah.
The dangers of unchecked power.
Right.
The perils of ideological extremism. And the importance of safeguarding democratic institutions and individual rights.
And perhaps most importantly,
Yeah.
it means cultivating empathy,
Right.
compassion,
Mm-hmm.
and a deep respect for human dignity.
So important.
It means recognizing our shared humanity, our interconnectedness, and our responsibility to stand up against injustice wherever we see it.
This deep dive into the Holodomor
Yeah.
has been a powerful reminder of the fragility of human life, the depths of human cruelty,
Right.
but also the resilience of the human spirit
It has.
and the enduring power of hope.
It's a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and understanding is a lifelong journey.
It is.
And that each deep dive, each encounter with the complexities of history
Right.
brings us closer to a more informed,
Yeah.
compassionate, and just world.
Thank you for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We encourage you to continue exploring the Holodomor,
Absolutely.
to share these stories,
Mm-hmm.
and to never forget the millions of lives lost to this horrific tragedy.
Right.
Their memory compels us to work towards a world
Yeah.
where such atrocities are never repeated.
Absolutely.